some in the Obama administration officials lobby against a war with Iran. Other members of the president's cabinet are now speaking out about another threat, that coming from ISIS. Defense Secretary Ash Carter made a surprise visit to Iraq today as Iraqi officials prepared to launch a U.S.-backed ground mission to try and retake the city of Ramadi from ISIS. You may recall that fell into the hands of the terrorist group a couple of months ago. Now, this visit came just hours after FBI Director James Comey called ISIS a bigger threat to the U.S. national interest than al-Qaeda.
What keeps me up at night is probably these days the ISIL threat in the homeland.
Is that now a bigger threat to the U.S. homeland than al-Qaeda?
Yes. Well, they have adopted a model that takes advantage of social media in a way to crowdsource terrorism. ISIL is buzzing on your hip, right? That message is being pushed all day long, and if you want to talk to a terrorist, they're right there on Twitter direct messaging for you to communicate with.
Joining the discussion now is senior analyst with Flashpoint Global Partners, Laith Al-Khouri. Thank you very much, Laith, for joining us. Let me start with that assessment that we just heard from the FBI director. Is ISIS now more of a threat than al-Qaeda, and if so, why?
Of course, it is how you analyze the threat. But indeed, I believe that ISIS is today the single most dangerous emerging threat that we are facing. It's different from the progenitor of ISIS that used to be al-Qaeda in Iraq back in the day. But that is not to say that al-Qaeda is no longer dangerous. Indeed, it is still dangerous. It is still, its focus is still on targeting Western countries, primarily the United States, while ISIS is more focused on expanding territorially, while at the same time attempting to recruit individuals in the West. So I believe Director Comey's comment indeed is very valid, that ISIS is today the single most dangerous emerging threat that we are facing.
And Joel, talking about the Secretary of Defense's visit to Iraq, obviously this potential ground operation to retake Ramadi is extremely significant. A couple of months ago, we heard from the Chief of Staff, Martin Dempsey, who at the time said that losing Ramadi was not symbolic in any way. So I wanted to get your sense. Do you think that the U.S. has a clear strategy here in terms of defeating ISIS when it comes to Iraq specifically?
It does, and working closely with the Iraqi government is central to this. There are forces on the ground in Iraq, like the Kurds as well, that can help, but ultimately the Iraqi state needs to be together, and that means the U.S. with the central government. But there's a bit of an irony here and a disconnect in what's happening in Washington. The Obama administration sought authorization for the war against ISIS and focusing on Iraq. Does not want to take that up. So Congress does not want to vote on authorization for war in one that we're involved in, but it does want to vote on blocking a nuclear deal, one that would prevent a war. So right now there's a very serious disconnect, but the administration is very active on Iraq nonetheless.
And Joe, let me ask you this, which is there have been a few publications now. You know, Stephen Walt wrote a piece about whether or not the U.S. can live with Harvard. Yesterday, the New York Times had a piece as well talking about outlining ISIS's success in terms of their governance capability. Do you see a scenario in which by ISIS can remain on the ground where it is today and it becomes a new reality in terms of not trying to destroy it, but accepting it for its presence in those two countries, Iraq and Syria?
Well, I certainly hope not. And for the people of Iraq and Syria, this is a nightmare. But this is a long fight. This is one that's going to take a very significant amount of time. Clearly, the direct threat to Americans from the propaganda, what Director Comey spoke about, and the threats here, that is significant in the near term. But yes, in the long term, in Iraq and Syria, the territory gained by ISIS, that will be hard to take back. But it's going to take real effort and partnership with forces on the ground, in addition to the ongoing airstrikes. But it will take time.
And Laith, obviously we heard the FBI director there make reference to the fact that ISIS uses social media and reaches you everywhere. You follow this very closely. What efforts are there underway now to try to stop that social media recruitment?
Well, there are efforts on government side, and there are efforts as a grassroots, and we see that, you know, the U.S. government and other governments' efforts to combat ISIS online has really failed. We have not seen anything successful. Their tweets remain well over 100,000 a day. They remain recruiting individuals in the West. Their propaganda is everywhere. So that's not really being diminished. But to combat ISIS effectively, we really need, you know, grassroots campaigns that are popping up on the ground in Iraq and Syria and countries in the Middle East who would combat ISIS with its own ideology, to pin down certain interpretations of Sharia law that they are actually utilizing in their propaganda and try to actually rebuttal that. And I think this would be one of the main effective tools against ISIS, at least in the preliminary stages.
Laith El-Khoury and Joel Rubin, thank you both.